There, and welcome to another Minecraft video. I know it's been a while. I've done mods, and that's about it. Wow, those guys are loud. Um, but yeah, I've started playing around with the new features of the 1.13 snapshots, and I think some of the things they've added to commands are amazing, and I wanted to try to make something cohesive with them. So using the new directional location selectors and uh, and the new tags for functions and some old techniques for timing, I've combined them all and come up with an NPC system, which is more or less self-contained as a library in function tags and a data pack, which you can download in the description below. Um, and I want to show you what it does first, and then to explain how it works, there's kind of some details to get into, some background information for you to understand how it works. So I just want to show you what it does first. So Minecraft is full of features with command blocks and special blocks that you can only get in creative mode, and all sorts of things that you can do to make custom maps that are amazing. Some of them are so amazing that they don't even feel like Minecraft anymore. Um, and it's really cool, but the one thing that Minecraft has never had are real NPCs that you can interact with. The closest we have are villagers, and as you can see, I am using villagers for this system. But villagers on their own don't do much, right? You talk to them, and they trade with you, and that's about it. They don't have any dialogue, they don't have any special actions they do, they're just there for trading, that's it. So for a custom map, if you want real NPCs, you gotta make them yourself. And until now, there hasn't really been a good way to do that, because there hasn't been a good way to tell who you're interacting with. Um, I've seen maps use pressure plates, where you walk up to a pressure plate, or even push a button to talk to a person, but that doesn't feel very immersive, because it's like, oh, I want to talk to you, why do I have to step on the pressure plate right here, and only here, right? In a previous map that I started making for 110, that I kind of abandoned when 111 changed a lot of the commands and broke a lot of things. But what I was doing was detecting when you talk to a villager and then assuming that the closest villager was the one you were talking to and kind of working on that assumption. But that wasn't a great thing because, like, what if this guy was here and I'm standing here and I talk to him? He might be closer, but I'm talking to him. And I don't want the system to get confused, and the old system did. But now that we have directional positions or directional coordinates, I guess, whatever they're called, these things, we can actually determine who the player is talking to by following where they're looking. So let me show you what I mean. So we have Bobby Buy trees over here by the trees, and Bobby Buy blocks over there by the command blocks. So if we talk to Bobby Buy trees, he says, so what's new? And you can see from the text, it is Bobby Buy trees. The game knows we're talking to Bobby Buy trees. And it even has a little system set up for manual continuation. So you can have, you can wait for player input or some other thing to happen before you continue with the dialogue or the sequence. And you'll see when I get to the explanation that the sequences can be any sequence of command blocks at all. They don't have to be just dialogue. They don't have to be dialogue at all. They can do whatever sequence you want. And at any point in those sequences, you can wait for player input or for some kind of player interaction. You'll see what I mean when I get to the explanation. But for now, Bobby Bytrees wants to know what's new, and all I can do is click the arrow to continue. So I click it, he says, okay, it's cool, and it says Bobby Bytrees said that. That's just so you know that the game knows that Bobby Bytrees is the one I clicked. Now you might say, oh, well, it says Bobby Bytrees already in the text, but this part is hard-coded. This part, however, where it says Bobby Bytrees said that, that's not hard-coded. That is using an entity selector, and that'll show you once we get, again, into the explanation, that the system can detect which villager was clicked. So in this case, I'm just using it to output which villager was clicked, But you can use it for more complicated things by having your sequences change according to who is clicked. So you can have multiple villagers, multiple NPCs, share the same sequences, but do different things in different parts of them. So you can get really complex with this if you want to work it out. But to show you a little more about what the system can do, we have Bobby Bytrees. We know what he does. Well, let's go talk to Bobby Byblocks. Bobby Byblocks is now talking because the game knows I'm looking at Bobby Byblocks. Now notice I haven't really moved. I might have moved a little bit, but that was unintentional. I just turned my head. So now I'm looking at Bobby Byblocks, and the game knows I'm looking at Bobby Byblocks. So Bobby Byblocks says, trees are so yesterday. Don't tell my brother that. That would be Bobby Bytrees. Thanks for keeping my secret. Okay, so in this case, we didn't have any manual input. We just had a nice scripted interaction. But here's what's cool. I haven't moved, I haven't changed anything, and now I'm going to talk to Bobby Byblocks again. Bobby Byblocks, as he says, can say different things at different times and have longer pauses like that one, which took 4 seconds instead of the usual 2 seconds. Or sorry, instead of the usual 1 second. So, in case you haven't been paying attention, between each line of text, except for the manual entry, there was a 1 second delay. But when he said, I can even have longer pauses like this one, it took 4 seconds. And that's because the amount of time between each step in an interaction, in a sequence, can be completely customized very simply by you. And now he says, and maybe next I'll switch back. So if you talk to him, guess what? He switches back to what he said before. And every time you talk to him, he goes back and forth. And then the long pause. And then maybe next time I'll switch back. And you get the point. In this case, I've programmed it so that he just goes back and forth. But you can make it do whatever you want. You can switch between as many sequences as you want. You can, if you have a randomizer installed, and there are plenty of function randomizers for Minecraft, so you can add one of those libraries and randomize which sequence comes next. I mean, the possibilities are limitless. So, let me kind of show you, once you have, excuse me, let's try that again. Once you have this data pack installed with all the function tags, in order to set up your sequences, it's really pretty simple. So if you look over here, you'll see that there is this, these chains. There are these chains. Each of these chains is a different sequence. And you'll notice it's going back and forth between impulse blocks and chain blocks, and impulse blocks and chain blocks. So remember how I said that you can have a different delay between each step in a sequence. So each of these impulse blocks represents a new step in the sequence, and it can do whatever you want. You can have as many chains as you want. So you can have, in this case, each of the steps is just one command, and then a chain block to set the delay for the next step in the sequence. But you could have, 500 chain blocks in one step if you want. That's all up to you. It depends what you want your sequences to do. So if we come over here, the armor stands I'll get to in a second, but if you check here, this first block is just the first step in your sequence, the thing that triggers as soon as you talk to a villager that's set to use this sequence. And in this case, it's just a tell raw for Bobby Bytrees to say what's new. And this is what I was talking about when I said this part is hard-coded, because Bobby Bytrees is hard-coded into this sequence, right? So if anybody else were to use this sequence, it would still say Bobby Bytrees at this point. However, at the end of the sequence, instead of saying Bobby Bytrees with a hard-coded string, it says whoever said that based on a selector here. And as you can see, it's just a simple selector called NPC Speaking. It's a tag called NPC Speaking, and any entity with that tag will be the current entity that is speaking, the last entity that was interacted with, right? So anywhere in your sequences, you can use this selector to do whatever you want. You can execute on them to have conditional stuff happen. You can move them around, reposition them, spin them, change their armor, or give them items. Whatever you could do with a selector, you can do in your sequence. By using this tag, it will always affect the NPC that was spoken to last, or that is currently running its sequence, right? So that part of the system makes it really simple. So you have step 1, which is the so what's new, and then step 2 in this sequence says click the arrow to continue, and I'll talk I'll talk about actually making it clickable and stuff like that in a second. But what happens between these steps? Well, there's a delay, right? There's a 1-second delay. So that's where this comes in. At the end of each step, except the last one, because you don't need a delay for the next step after the last step, because there is none. But at the end of each intermediate step, you have a block that sets the delay. And the way you set the delay is you summon an area effect cloud at the position of the next impulse block for the next step. In this case, this impulse block right here for the second step is just 1 over in the x direction. So we summon 1 in the x direction. It can be anywhere in the world though, as long as you get the coordinates right, so that you summon the area effect cloud inside the next impulse block in your sequence. That cloud must have a tag called timer, which you can set when you summon it like this, right? Tags timer. The duration one is not necessary, but it does help keep everything clean, because what that'll do is as soon as the next step triggers, it's going to delete the entity. The particle end rod, you don't need to set this. I just like it because end rod particles are small, and so they tend not to be visible, and that makes things a little more clean. If you like to see which part of each sequence is executing, you can leave that out and you'll see little spell particles around whatever step is going to come next. And that's great if you like that. So you can leave this out and it would work just fine. But I like it in. So particle, end rod, just because, again, end rod particles are small and clean. But here is the other part. The age is -20. This is where you set the delay until the next step. So after this step happens, it will run this command block at the end, because it's the chain block at the end of the impulse. And it's going to summon it. It's going to summon this area effect cloud. Now the tag is what allows it to use the system from the functions, this NPC system, which, by the way, I'm tentatively calling it EZ-NPC, but I don't know. If you can think of a better name, let me know, and I might change it. But this age is the delay until the next step. So it's -20, which means in 20 ticks, the next step will happen. And 20 ticks is 1 second, right? So this is saying in 1 second, run the next step. And it has to be negative. So the way the system works is it's going to look for an area effect cloud, right, which is what we're summoning here, an area effect cloud. It's going to look for an area effect cloud with a tag of timer and an age of exactly 0. Now, area effect clouds keep track of their age by adding 1 to their age each tick. So if it starts out negative, at some point, it's going to hit 0. And when it hits 0, that's when the next step in the sequence will trigger, right? So by setting it to -20, it will take 20 ticks to reach 0, so the next step will happen 20 ticks or 1 second later. See? Not really that complicated, you just have to know how ages and ticks work. So always negative, and then the number of ticks that you want until your next step happens. So here it's 20 ticks or 1 second. But we have over here where it says from Bobby buy blocks, as he said, I can have even longer pauses. So after that step, we set the age to -80 for the next area effect cloud, because 80 ticks is 4 seconds, right? So by doing that, that's what makes it wait 4 seconds till the next step instead of 1 second, which would be 20 ticks. A lot of numbers, I know. Hopefully I was clear on that. So that's how you set the delay. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So, or that's at least all it takes to create a sequence, right? So each step is an impulse block, and then at the end of each step, at the end of each step's chain, you just summon an area effect cloud inside the next impulse block in your sequence with a tag of timer and an age that is negative, and then however many ticks you want to wait till the next step. Pretty simple. And so in this case, it's just a bunch of tell rows. So how do you do manual ones, right? Because if you do that, it's just going to trigger every 20 ticks, every 80 ticks, whatever you set it to, but it's going to happen automatically. How do you wait for player input? Well, that is where this comes in. So when you install this function pack and you reload the world or reload datapacks, it's going to add a scoreboard objective called continue into your world. And it's going to be a trigger score. And basically, anytime, well, okay, let me explain just a second. So this step creates a manual timer. So this is the same thing as before, an area effect cloud inside the block that starts the next step in the sequence. But you want to set the age to something like -2. It doesn't matter what it is, but it must be less than -1. So -2 here is a good starting point, because this is going to be manually triggered, so the time doesn't matter. But it must be less than -1 for technical reasons. And then you'll see it has the timer tag, but it also has a manual tag. By giving it a manual tag, you're saying the next step will not start until it gets manual input, right? And so that's how we created that click me. So how do you give it manual input? How do you tell it, okay, if you're currently waiting for input on a manual step in a sequence, how do you tell it to actually trigger that? And the answer is with that continue. So it's going to create that continue scoreboard objective. And if any player has a scoreboard value of 1 or higher in their continue score, it's going to start the next step. Or rather, it's going to trigger all the manual steps that are currently waiting for players, right? So in this case, I used some JSON text. So we had the tell raw, and tell raw lets you write out JSON text into the chat, and we saw that with all the other steps. But in this case, we're using a feature of tell raw called the click event. So if any part of your JSON text has a click event, it can do stuff when you click it. In this case, the action we're telling it to do is to run a command. So anyone who clicks it, it will run a command from them as if they typed it into chat. And so the command that we're running is the value, which is trigger continue add 1, which means, so continue is a scoreboard objective of type trigger. So that means we're going to take this scoreboard objective and we're going to trigger it and add 1 to it from whichever user clicks on this part of the chat, right? And so all that really does is, if their score was 0, now it's 1. That's it. But the system knows that if anyone has a continue score of 1 or higher, then any manual clouds waiting to trigger their steps should trigger instantly. And so that's what triggers the next step. Now, in this case, like I said, I just used the tell raw, but you don't have to use the tell raw, because trigger objectives don't have to be triggered by a click or something like that. You can just set them. So I could do scoreboard players set at s, which is me, continue 1. I can set it to 1. Now it's going to set it back to 0 because the system constantly sets everything, sets all the continue scores back to 0, so that it doesn't keep triggering the manual steps. But you can set it like that, which means anywhere in your sequences, anywhere in any command blocks outside of this sequences, anywhere you want, you can set someone's score for continue to 1, and that will trigger the next manual step. So you could have, something like a sequence that spans a long period of time. If you know that they're not going to talk to any other NPCs, you can have it be all one sequence. Like one part of the sequence could say, find the missing nether star, right? And it would just stop there because the next step would be manual. But then once the player finds the nether star, you set continue to 1, and the sequence continues, and it might say, congratulations, you found the star, or something like that, right? I don't know. I'm sure you could think of more creative and cool uses for it, but the idea is that you can have both automatic sequences with the by just setting a timer area effect cloud with an age, or you can have manual sequences by setting a timer manual tags onto an area effect cloud with an age of -2, and that'll wait for someone's continue score to equal 1 or greater, right? And then that just goes on to the next thing that just said, okay, that's cool, and then said who was speaking. And yeah, so remember, you can use the NPC speaking tag to figure out which NPC was clicked last. And so you can use that however you want. So that's pretty much it. So before I get into how to switch between sequences and do things like that, I have to talk about these armor stands. So these armor stands here are armor stands that determine what the ID of the sequence below them is. So every sequence is going to have an ID. And those are determined by having an armor stand on top of the first impulse block in the sequence that will have a score of sequence ID. So if we do scoreboard objectives set display sidebar, you have NPC Sequence ID. Oh, tab. Okay. Nope, not NPC Interact. Sorry. NPC Sequence ID. There we go. We have NPC Sequence ID. So that's a score that the function pack is going to add. That's an objective. And basically, each armor stand here has a value which represents the ID of the sequence that the block below it starts. So this block starts sequence 1. So this armor stand has an NPC Sequence ID score of 1. This block starts sequence 2. So this one has a score of 2. This block starts sequence 3. So this armor stand has a NPC Sequence ID score of 3. And this is how we start doing fancy things. So all you have to do is give a villager an NPC Sequence ID score. That's it. Once you give a villager an NPC Sequence ID score, then whenever a player talks to them, or tries to talk to them, it will trigger the sequence that matches their ID. So in this case, over here we have Bobby Bytrees. He has a NPC Sequence ID score of 1. So you can see in the scoreboard on the side, there are 2 entities with a score of 1. So those 2 entities are Bobby Bytrees and this armor stand. Because they match, when someone talks to Bobby Bytrees, this armor stand is going to trigger the block below it and start the sequence, right? So that's how that works. And with Bobby Byblocks, he has a score of 2, and you can see there are 2 things with a score of 2 on the side. So the one of them is Bobby Byblocks, and the other is this armor stand. And since this is above here, when you try to talk to Bobby Byblocks, it's going to trigger sequence 2, which is this one. Right? And so this is how you start doing fancy things, because at the end of this sequence, you can do things like this. You can take whichever villager has the NPC speaking tag, which again is going to be the last clicked villager, or the last clicked NPC, and it's going to set their NPC Sequence ID score to 3. So originally it's 2. When you click it, it's going to go through the sequence 2, and then it's going to set its Sequence ID score to 3, which means the next time you click it, it's going to have an NPC Sequence ID score of 3, and it's going to trigger sequence 3, which is over here because this armor stand has an NPC Sequence ID of 3, right? And then at the end of this sequence, we just set it back to 2. So then next time it comes back to 2. And that's how it goes back and forth like we saw, right? And again, you can do some really complicated things with this. You can have things that change according to context. So for instance, I don't know, you could give little Bobby Byblocks over there a tag, and then so you can reference him from your systems. And then let's say someone completes a goal, you can change his NPC Sequence ID based on that goal to use a different sequence and say some different things, maybe do some different things, maybe give you some items because you accomplished it. So maybe he's a merchant, but if you try to talk to him the first time, he has Sequence ID of 1, and that sequence just says, I don't want to give you anything, come back when you've found the Holy Grail. And then as they go through your map, when they find the Holy Grail, you change his Sequence ID to 2, and in sequence 2, you say, here's the Holy Grail, and you give them an item, right? So you could do all kinds of complicated things. And like I said, there are randomization libraries randomization functions for Minecraft that have already been made since the first functions came out in 1.12. And so you can use those to pick a random sequence. So let's say somebody has three, sequences 4, 5, and 6, and it just randomly picks between them. So then just at the end of each of those sequences, you pick a random number between 4 and 6 and set their NPC Sequence ID score to that value, and it'll pick a random sequence. So you can do some really cool things. And the idea here is not to make your sequences for you. The idea is just to give you the library and the function pack that does the boring, tedious work for you, so that all you have to do is design your map, right? You design your map, you decide what each sequence does, but you don't have to worry about figuring out who was clicked. You don't have to worry about any of the timing except to determine what the timing is, right? With this -20. You don't have to worry about controlling the timing or controlling the sequences. You don't have to worry about any of that. You just match a villager's ID to an armor stand's ID and have that armor stand on top of some command blocks that set area effect clouds with a tag of timer, and you're done. And your entire thing is done. Now, I will admit this does have one flaw. If you talk to a villager from behind another villager, you'll see I clicked Bobby Buy blocks, but it ran sequence 1 for Bobby Buy trees, and it says Bobby Buy trees said that, right? So what happens is when you right click on a villager, the system is going to raycast, which means it's going to send out a marker, in this case an armor stand, from your position in the direction you're facing until it hits a villager, basically. And if it doesn't hit a villager within 3 seconds, it just stops so that you don't have armor stands clouding up your world. If it doesn't hit a villager in 3 seconds, though, that's 60 blocks away, then the chances are it's never going to actually hit a villager. So, but yeah, so because it starts for me and goes out, if I click over this guy's shoulder, right, on the way between me and there, it's going to be close enough to Bobby Buy trees that it's going to think, hey, this is who you clicked. Now, I did experiment, and I tried looking at a smaller radius around this little raycast, and it worked, except that if you clicked too low on the villager, it wouldn't recognize it at all. So like if I click this villager's feet, it would just not recognize that I clicked anything. It would just go right through them. So in order to detect anywhere on the villager, I had to give it a wider radius, and that means if you're close enough to another villager, like between you and your NPC, it can mess up. On the other hand, that's true of basically every other system made before this as well. But the other system would also have problems if I stood here and spoke to Bobby Buy blocks because he's closer. This system won't do that. Or, okay, sorry. Poor example, I'm standing in the block with him. If I walk a little closer, there you go. So you can see there are still some bugs to work out, but the idea is pretty simple, and it works for the most part. Just keep your villagers a decent distance away. Like if I move Bobby Buy trees, execute at E, type villager scores NPC sequence ID equals 1. So Bobby Buy trees has sequence 1. Oh, limit equals 1. All right, still getting used to this new syntax. Execute as that at S, run teleport. He's standing back there, so I can just do nope. Sorry, left, right, up, down, forward, back. So we're going to move him back by 2 blocks. There you go. So now, if I'm standing here, even though he is closer, it goes to Bobby by blocks. So yeah. So again, not perfect, but it's much better than any system we've had before. And as long as you keep your villagers, far enough away that you don't have to stand like on top of another villager or behind another villager to talk to someone, then everything should work perfectly. So that's the system. Again, the download is below. Now, I'm going to take you through a quick walkthrough of the code, the actual function code. If you don't care about that, you can stop watching now and just download from the link below. If you do care, I hope you don't care too much because I want to make this quick. This has been a long video already, so I'm going to try to just kind of skim through it. So we have a couple of things here. So the first thing we're using is function tags. And function tags are something new to 1.13. In fact, they're new, I think, to, I want to say, the snapshot that came out just like a couple weeks ago. But what they allow you to do is have things that run every tick, or just when the game loads, or when you reload your data pack. So they're kind of like the old game rule of game loop function, but that's not a thing anymore because it's clunky, and this is much better. So when we load, we're going to run EZ-NPC init. So when the world loads or when you reload the data pack, it's going to run this code. This is EZ-NPC init. It's just going to add the necessary objective. So the continue is a trigger objective, which we saw. That's when you have manual steps in your sequences. It's going to wait for someone to have a continue score of 1 or higher, and that's when it'll continue on with the manual triggers, or sorry, the manual steps. So it adds that objective. It adds NPC Interact. And that's used for a few different things. But mostly it's used to detect, well, as you can see here, it's Minecraft Talk to Villager. In 1.13, for whatever reason, they changed the name of this stat because it's not stats anymore, but they changed it to custom Minecraft.talk-to-villager. I don't understand why the custom part. I don't really get it, but I'm not Mojang. So this is what they call it. So this will increase for every player whenever they talk to a villager. And that includes even villagers that don't have trades. If you try to talk to a villager, this will increase. It's also used in the code for certain things like having the little raycast entity kill itself after 3 seconds of searching if it can't find anything, and stuff like that. Then we've got NPC Sequence Id, which is a dummy, and we saw exactly what that's used for. That's how we link the armor stands on top of the sequence command blocks with the NPCs that should trigger them when spoken to, right? So if an NPC has a NPC Sequence ID that matches an armor stand, then when that NPC is spoken to, that armor stand will trigger the block below it, right? Pretty simple. So that's it. That's the initialization. So that's what happens on load. Now the tick tag is for things that run every tick, and in this case, it's running EZ-NPC loop. And EZ-NPC loop is this, and this is the main brunt of the code. Now what's really, really cool is that as complicated and flexible as this system is, because we have those directional position markers, or whatever you want to call them, these things, it allows me to make this system in basically less than 30 lines of code. Yeah, and that's including blank spaces and comments for clarity. Still less than 30 lines of code, which is really cool. But anyway, so the first thing we have is the sequence control, and this is what makes the sequences work. It's what makes the timing between each step of the sequence work. It's what makes the manual sequences work. All of that stuff. So really quickly, any timer that has a manual tag that has an age of -1, so right before it would actually trigger at age of 0, it sets its entity data and sets its age back to -2. So basically, The timers are just these area effect clouds with a timer tag. When they hit an age of 0, they trigger. So the manual ones are just constantly bouncing back between -1 and -2 so that they never hit 0 until they're triggered, right? And that just keeps them alive long enough, actually it keeps them alive forever until they should actually trigger because someone has a continued score of 1 or higher, right? So that's the next part. If they are a manual timer, then we execute this code which sets its age to 0, which triggers it, only if there is a player, because @A only applies to players. So if it finds an entity, which is a player with a continue score of 1 or higher. So the ... means or higher. So continue is 1 or higher. If it finds that entity, so if it finds a player with that score, then it runs this. So this is another 1.13 feature that actually came in really handy here. And it allows you to run a command only if a certain selector finds something. So in this case, we're just looking for a player with that score, and if they have the score of continue of 1 or higher, then we set the manual timer's age to 0 to trigger it, right? And also this is new as well, having the scores be, it's not really an object because of that equal sign syntax. I don't know what the name of this kind of syntax is, but it's a new selector syntax. So you can do a list of scores here and their values, and you can say equals some value, and it has to be exactly that, or some value ... and it can be that or higher. Or I could do, actually I have it here, you can do equals ... and some value, and that means that value or lower. You could even do something like, if I wanted to, that, like 1.5, and that means any value between 1 and 5, but not less than and not greater than, right? In this case, we don't need to do that, but just letting you know it exists now. So yeah, if someone has a continuous score of 1, it triggers the manual area effect clouds by setting their age to 0. So then the next two lines are what actually trigger the command blocks at the positions of those of any timer AoE clouds with age 0. So it just sets auto 1 and then auto 0, which triggers an impulse command block through code. And then it kills it. So before, when I mentioned that having the duration equal to 1 to make sure it dies is for just kind of cleanup and just kind of making sure things work, this code should automatically do that. However, let's say you accidentally misspell the tag, so you don't actually set the timer tag in there, like maybe you have a typo and you type timmer. So if you do that, this code is not going to find it, and that AoE cloud will sit around. So that's why I set the duration. It's mostly just for cleanup and just making sure that things don't stick around. But the code should kill it if you do everything right. So you don't need the duration in there, is what I'm saying. And then it just resets the continue score to 0 so that if a player continues, it just continues for one step and then doesn't keep continuing forever. And then it enables it, because the way triggers work, once you trigger something, once you trigger an objective, you can't trigger it again until it's re-enabled for you. So this just makes sure that it's always enabled for everyone. Even after you trigger it, you can trigger it again in the next tick, right? And that's the sequence control. That's how all the timing works, right? So now we have the NPC Interaction Detection. So this is what detects which NPC you've clicked on when you click on an NPC. So if someone has an NPC Interact score of 1 or higher, which is, there, the NPC Interact score is when you talk to a villager, right? If they have that score of 1 or higher, then at their position, you summon an armor stand, which in this case is invisible, small, no gravity, marker, invulnerable, and has the tags NPC Finder and new. Invulnerable and small and marker, those are all not necessary, but for instance, if you're, I don't know, talking to a villager, you're looking through lava or something. You don't want the armor stand to burn, so you'd want to set it to invulnerable, right? Excuse me. Or if there's someone in creative mode clicking around, you don't want them to break it before it hits the villager, stuff like that. So invulnerable is for safety. Small and marker, I don't think they're entirely necessary. I was playing around with them to try to get the hitbox detection a little more precise. I don't think they actually did anything for that, but I left them in just in case because they work. You could, if you want to play around with it and test it, you could try removing those and see if it really changes the precision and the accuracy of the detection. But I don't think you really need those two. No gravity is important because if you're looking up, you don't want, let's say you're down below and the villager's standing on a ledge above you, you don't want that armor stand to have gravity because otherwise it's not going to go up to that villager, it's just going to fall. So no gravity is important. And obviously invisible because you don't want to see the raycast. And these tags are very important. This is what triggers the next, or this is what allows the rest of the code to target them. So you have this armor stand, and it's got this ID of new, or sorry, this tag of new. And that tag is used because when you summon something at the player's position, it doesn't take on the player's rotation. But in order to know which direction you're looking, you need to take on the player's rotation. And there are a couple of ways you can do that in 1.13. You could use the execute store command to get the NBT data from the player and store each X, Y, and Z rotation, or I guess XZ or pitch and yaw, whatever it's called, whatever. The two types of rotation from the player and store it in the armor stand, but that's more complicated than it needs to be because instead what you can do is for any new NPC finder, so the one that was just summoned, then you want to teleport them to the nearest player with a score of NPC Interactive 1 or higher. Now, since they were summoned at the player's location, the nearest player with that score should be the player that clicked on the villager, right? In fact, I think the chances of it not being are basically 0. So it will be that player. So it will teleport to that player. And when you teleport one entity to another, it will always take on the rotation of the entity it's teleporting to. So in this case, the armor stand is going to be rotating to match the player, right? So now it's going to face the same direction as the player. And then we remove new, because if we don't remove that, then every tick, it's going to keep teleporting back to the player, and that's going to ruin everything. So we remove new. But now it still has the NPC finder tag. So now, all the NPC finders, we check if there's a villager within less than or equal to 1.65 blocks. That number is just kind of trial and error. I tried 1 block, and it, like I said, it didn't find the villagers if you clicked on their feet. But I didn't want to go 2 blocks because I thought that would be too high, so I went with 1.5. It still had some issues as you got like too low, like too close to the bottom of their feet. So then 1.65 seemed to be a nice sweet spot where it picked up the villagers no matter where you clicked on them. So that's the distance. So any villager, if there is a villager within 1.65 blocks of the NPC finder, then we first remove all NPC speaking tags. So the way the system works with the NPC speaking is it adds it right here. So again, if it finds a villager within 1.65 blocks, it then tags the nearest one villager within 1.65 blocks with the NPC interacted score, which is not the same tag as NPC speaking. NPC interacted. And so the issue that I had before was there was no way for the system to know when to remove the NPC speaking tag, right? Because it doesn't know when a sequence has completed because the sequences can last however long you want. It depends on the delay between each step. If there's manual ones, then it could be variable and you don't even know how long it's going to take. So I had 2 options. I could either make it so that you had to explicitly remove the NPC speaking tag at the end of each of your sequences, which was okay, but if you forgot to do it, it would mess stuff up. and it just seems kind of tedious to have to add that to the end of every single sequence. So the other option was every time you click on a new NPC, all the old NPCs have their tag removed. And by doing that, it ensures that at any given point, only one NPC has this tag, and that is the NPC that was clicked last. The downside to this means that if all of the sequences are finished, there's no sequences running, then the NPC speaking tag will still be on the last villager that was clicked. But as long as you keep that in mind and don't try to use that tag outside of a sequence, you should be fine. But yeah, so then it sets their tag, or it adds their tag of NPC interacted, and then it kills the ray trace because it's already found its villager and it's done. You don't want it to keep going because if there's two villagers in a row, you don't want it to pick the one behind it. You only want it to find the first one and stop. So it kills itself if it finds a villager within 1.65 blocks. Right? And then any NPC finder that is left will be teleported one block ahead of itself in the direction it's facing. And since it was facing the direction the player was facing, that's the direction it's going to move in. Right? So this is what makes this possible, is being able to use those. So then we also add to the NPC finder's NPC Interact score, we add 1, and we kill it if it goes over 60. And that's just making sure that that these ray tracing entities don't last longer than 3 seconds. Because again, if it's searching for longer than 3 seconds, that's like 60 blocks out, and it doesn't find anything, then chances are there was some mistake and it's never going to find anything, and you don't want that armor stand just flying off into the distance forever, right? You want to clear them out and keep the number of entities in your world as low as possible. So this does that for you. And then it sets all players, not entities, just players, the NPC Interact score to 0, because now it's already processed all of the players who have spoken to villagers since the last tick. So it doesn't need to do that again next tick, so it sets them back to 0, right? So this is, so that's the NPC Interaction Detection. And by the end of all of this, it should ray trace, and it should set the NPC interacted score of the villager you clicked, or it should set the NPC interacted tag onto the villager that you clicked, right? So once that's all done, now we have the part of the code that triggers a sequence from the NPC. And so how does it do that? So it has to find which of those armor stands on top of the sequences match the ID of the villager that was clicked, right? So the way it does that is that for each armor stand with a tag of NPC sequence, it's going to subtract from their NPC sequence ID the value of the NPC interacted villager's NPC sequence ID. Now there's one thing I forgot to mention, so let me go back into the world for a second. Okay. So if we were to check out the tags of this armor stand, so tag @e type equals armor stand, limit equals 1, sort equals nearest list, you can see it has a tag of NPC sequence. And if we do limit equals 3, you can see the 3 entities have one total tag, which is NPC sequence, right? So these all have the same tag of NPC sequence. And that is how you tell the system that this armor stand is on top of a command block for a sequence, right? So it's going to take all of the NPC sequences, so that is all of the armor stands with the tag NPC sequence. It's going to subtract from their ID the ID of the interacted villager. And then it's going to look at the NPC sequence that has an ID of exactly 0, right? So if you subtract two numbers together, or I guess subtract two numbers from each other, the only way that you'll end up with exactly 0 is if those numbers started out the same, right? So if the number was 5, you can only get 0 by subtracting 5. the number was -3. You can only get 0 by subtracting -3. Any other number, and you're going to get something else. You're going to get, if it's 4, you'll get 5 minus 4 is 1. If it's 6, 5 minus 6 is -1, right? No matter what, they have to be both matching to get a 0, which means when you subtract this out, whichever one has an ID of 0, that's going to be the NPC sequence armor stand that matches the ID of the villager that was clicked, right? And so all we do is we execute at the position of that armor stand, and we summon an area effect cloud, which has a tag of timer and an age of -1. And what that does is it allows the sequence control then in the next tick, the age will go from -1 to 0, and it'll trigger as though it were a regular timer. Now I could have set auto 1B, auto 0B, and done that here, but that just seems unnecessary. That would be code duplication, right? Because we already have that done over here. We already have a system to do that, so we'll just use that system instead of copying code. And so that kind of helps keep the code concise, short, easily readable. So it creates a timer at the position 1 block below the NPC sequence armor stand with an NPC sequence ID of 0, so the one that matches what we clicked. And so that triggers the sequence. And that's pretty much it. And then we just do some cleanup. We add the ID of the interacted NPC back because now all the IDs are messed up. So we have to add that back in to replace them. So if, let's say, the ID was 5, the NPC sequence was 3, well now after subtracting it'll be 2, but then we just add the 3 back in and it goes back to 5, right? Math. That's how it works. So that cleans up the mess we made by subtracting. And then we take whatever NPC was interacted with based on this ray tracing, and we add the NPC speaking tag. And that is what allows us to determine which entity was speaking in our sequence, because this tag gets set. And then we remove the NPC interacted tag so that the next tick, it doesn't also trigger this again, right? So that's why we have these two different tags, NPC interacted and NPC speaking, because we want a tag that will keep track of the entity that is speaking or the NPC that is speaking throughout a sequence, but we don't want to keep triggering the sequence throughout the sequence. So we need two different tags, one to say, hey, this is who you interacted with, and you should start a sequence, and then the other to say, within this sequence, this is the one who spoke, or this is the one who was interacted with, but don't keep triggering a sequence from them, right? So that's pretty much it. This video has gone on long enough. I hope you guys who are map makers out there like this. I hope you find it useful. The download is in the doobly-doo, in the link below. Nope, in the link in the description below. So I probably posted on Reddit as well, somewhere. And there's a good chance I might post it somewhere on Mindstruck, although Mindstruck is more for structures and not for datapacks, so maybe not. We'll see. But it'll definitely be in the description below and probably on Reddit. So download it. Let me know what you think about it. If you have any questions, if any of this was confusing, because I know I ramble a lot and I might not have been super clear, ask in the description, ask in the comments below, and I'll answer you. And hopefully this makes future maps have much better NPC interaction. And by the way, just to give credit where credit is due, the idea to use area effect clouds with negative ages as sort of sequencers is not my idea. That comes from a tutorial by Dr. Brian Lorgan. I will link to his channel in the description. All I did was I applied that to a ray tracing system so that it could be used with villagers as NPCs, and I added the ability to have manual timings in there as well with the triggers and stuff. But the idea of using the area effect clouds was Dr. Brian's, so check him out. He's got a really cool channel where he does all sorts of technical Minecraft stuff, and I recommend it if you're into this kind of map making stuff. Anyway, with that, I'm going to say goodnight because it is 5 a.m. and I have not slept yet. So, hope you all enjoyed this, and I hope you all enjoy the system, and I hope you guys use it. Again, any questions, comments, criticisms, whatever, comments below, and I'll respond as soon as I get them. Keep on map making.